Hello and welcome to today's episode of Pod in My Backyard, the podcast about solving the housing crisis. My name is McQuillan. I'm a housing campaigner and disgruntled private renter, and I am joined today by Mike Kingsella, who is over from the US. Mike is a housing campaigner, a keen YIMBY, and he's the CEO of Up for Growth. So welcome to the pod, Mike.
Thank you, Eve, for having me. It's very good to be here.
Thank you very much. So what is Up for Growth? What's your political background? Where do you come from? What's the housing situation for you?
Yeah, no, look, I'm a housing nerd, as I like to say.
Yep.
I studied urban planning out in Portland, Oregon, which is on the west coast of the U.S.
We've seen Portlandia,
and Portlandia is spot on. We have much of the culture that is on display on that program. And really, and I'll just sort of share that, before living in Portland, I grew up in Arkansas, which is about as far from urban America as
Bill
you
Clinton?
can. That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
That's the extent of my cultural references.
That's right.
Okay,
Mr. Clinton became president when I was a young boy in Arkansas, and then had the opportunity in the early 1990s to move out west. My father got a job, and there I was in the big city, at least from my perspective, in Portland. So I got a firsthand look at what a great American city can be. It was a time where Portland had abundant housing. And in fact, the joke in the late 90s was that Portland is the place where young people go to retire, and that was because of housing abundance. So a great beer scene, a great creative scene. It was one of the epicenters of the dot-com boom in the late 90s. And, it really goes back to why cities are such amazing creatures. They bring people together from all walks of life, from all income strata, to come together, innovate, and create great things.
That's the point, isn't it? If people can afford to live there. And that is what we're seeing, the opposite happening now with our kind of cultural decline, drying up because life is so expensive in the cities.
Yes, that's right. So my story is that I went to college, went and studied urban planning, and I was more of a finance type. And so I studied numbers, economics, real estate finance, and ultimately, after graduating, got married and moved down the San Francisco Bay Area and started a career in commercial real estate, which is what I did for about 15 years before going over to the policy side. So
How old are you?
I'm 44.
Great skin.
Thank you. So my story is that it's quite an unconventional entry point to public policy, but it really comes out of a passion that every person who wants to achieve their fullest potential should have the opportunity to. And at least in America, where I come from, it has become monstrously hard for builders to build the types of homes that so many are looking for today. It has become, I would say, impossible for folks of my generation. I'm Oregon Trail generation, right? Borderline millennial, and Gen Z behind me, to get into home ownership, certainly not at the age that their parents did. And so we've seen sort of the vacuuming of opportunity out of America's great cities because of, frankly, the housing shortage that we're experiencing. So that's my personal mission, to solve the shortage. That's why I formed Up for Growth several years ago, and that's why I do this work every day.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So give us some more detail on the American housing shortage. Where has it come from? What's going on? How does it map onto inequality? What are the policy decisions behind it? What's going on?
Well, it's a complicated story, as I know it is here in the UK as well. So I'll try to simplify, and we can unpack anything that you find particularly relevant to the conversation here. But America, like the UK, went through the Industrial Revolution. We built great cities, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Los Angeles, New York, San Francisco, Chicago. And we did so as we created lots of jobs, and these places became boom towns, right? So, I think there's this idea in America that, well, of course, New York is expensive. And of course, you have to make a lot of money to live in a place like New York. The fact is, in the 1920s, 1930s, people flocked to high opportunity cities because that's where the jobs were, that's where the innovation was, and it was abundant housing that was key to lots and lots of people to achieve their potential. And so part of our history is that, right? Cities being the growth engines of America. Flash forward to World War II, shipped millions of American young people to the Pacific and here to Europe to fight the war. A few years later, in the mid-1940s, they all came back, and these were kids who were living with mom and dad, now full-grown adults. And what we had at that point in time was a massive housing shortage, right? And not dissimilar to the dynamics that are at play today. You know, we had more than 8 million people returning to the U.S. suddenly looking for homes.
And that's because building hadn't happened during the war. Because
that's right. We had the same price controls that England had, right? We had the temporary rent control measures that effectively shut down housing production. We actually diverted all of our industrial capacity to building ships, building airplanes, making guns and all of that, right? And so we had stopped building, not because of regulatory barriers, but because of a conscious and deliberate action that our government at the time took, right? So when those folks came back, the narrative in America was federal government and state and local must act and act decisively to solve the soldiers' shortage of homes. And the way that we did that is that we innovated. We created the modern methods of construction at the time, factory built, or let's say assembly line built housing. Levittown is a very good example. Of course, that was sprawl.
What's Levittown? Tell me.
William Levitt and Sons was a very early mass production builder. And they were building homes, 800, 1,000 square feet, which were quite attractive at that point in time, right? We weren't building 3,000 square foot sheetrock palaces. We were building streetcar suburbs. But it was done, and we were able to get to scale on home building through applying that assembly line approach. We also invented new financial tools like the 30-year mortgage, right? I know here in the UK, you reprice your mortgage loans.
And what's a mortgage?
Many times throughout the ownership. In America, it's a 30-year term, believe it or not. And so what that did for Americans in the 1940s is it created a very low-cost way to buy that first home and to get into home ownership and build wealth. And so it was also a key way to solve the housing puzzle on the demand side. By giving the liquidity to Americans to purchase homes, we're essentially funding all of that construction. So that's our history, right?
Yeah. So there was a time when things were good.
There was a time, absolutely, where things were good.
Things are no longer good.
No.
In terms of U.S. housing. I heard U.S. homelessness has been up 30% since 2022.
It's unconscionable.
Worsening picture.
Absolutely. And we don't have the same social safety net, unfortunately, that other countries do.
Yeah, I would argue our social safety net is not particularly effective, unfortunately, but
Well, ours is arguably even worse. But having said that, let's flash forward to the 90s, which is the time when I was in Portland, Oregon. There was a flood of demand back into American cities. Walkable was cool. Walkable was where the jobs were. And there was a huge demand shift from what we call drivable suburban neighborhoods to walkable urban neighborhoods. So much so that today, the rent for a like-kind unit in a walkable urban neighborhood compared to a drivable suburban neighborhood can be as high as 40% price difference. So we have a situation where...
Similar to the UK, of course, with what we've seen from the end of the 80s, the focus on the service economy, jobs in city centres, and also the cleaning up of our city centres and our inner city areas, much less polluted, no industry anymore, and much more desirable places to live. We've seen a preference shift whereby people who, are more financially able are keener to live in inner city areas, and then we've seen a pushing out of poorer communities who historically lived in those areas, pushed to the outskirts of cities, and that gentrification process, because preferences have shifted and because housing construction hasn't kept up.
That's right. And a big part of the story, I skipped a really important component, which is our zoning system. And so America in the really beginning of the 1910s, we started to devise a system of zoning, which was very restrictive in the sense that it was monolithic. The homes that it contemplated were often large lot, single detached homes. So all of the stuff that America built at the turn of the century and before row houses, what you might call terrace homes, what you might call small homes or tiny homes, right? Cottage clusters, all were very abundant and popular, a very popular product type. Okay. But there was the sense of the bucolic leafy suburb, city beautiful at the time. Yeah. And that really influenced how America's regulations were crafted, such that today, in any given city, and there is great work from the National Zoning Atlas, which American thinker Sarah Bronin has developed, which show that in most American cities, it's a very small proportion. We're talking 20, 30% maybe of residential zone land that allows anything but large lot, quarter acre, single family homes.
Okay, so a problem in US cities about lack of density really in those high demand city areas. Talk us through what that looks like when you're walking down the street. Where are these suburbs that are, you know, nice, leafy, big gardens, etc., but perhaps not the best use of land in areas where people want to live?
Yeah, and part of it is our cities have grown up over this period of time. So if you visit, for example, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, or if you visit Boston, Massachusetts, or Washington, D.C., when you're in the core, in the historic urban core of these cities, you'll absolutely see towers. You know, of course, Manhattan is one of the densest, if not the densest, city in the country. But it's just that core. So what happened in the 1920s, 30s, leading into the 40s is the development of what we call streetcar suburbs. So we invested in transit, much like London did, trams, to carry folks who worked in the downtown cores and into the what were then suburbs. And they were very much typified by bungalow homes, right? Cottages that were on very large lots with white picket fences, the leafy suburbs that you've seen depicted in Hollywood.
I'm picturing American Pie and the houses that they live in, those kind of thing.
Right.
Maybe a bit smaller than those ones, but that kind of vibe. Okay, yeah.
That's right. And so at the time it made sense, right? It was a departure from the recent architecture, and it was a way to get back to nature if you were thinking about it in those terms.
Yeah, and of course the industry then as well was much dirtier.
That's right.
People didn't want to live in city centres because there was, or at least in the UK, because there was smog, there were factories, it was unhealthy.
Absolutely. And the same in New York and in Philadelphia. And so, but what happened over the following several decades is that our cities eventually subsumed what were then the suburbs, and that's why they're called today streetcar suburbs. And so in those places, you will see row homes. But as zoning policies were implemented, those zoning codes were really focused on the large lot single family home, right? So you might have existing uses that today are not compatible with single family zoning. Say you have a row home, it burns down, you can't rebuild what existed on that site. And similarly, builders who might want to deliver row homes, where by today's millennials...
So row home is a terraced house?
Yes, cool. Roughly speaking.
Roughly.
I'm not an architect, but certainly comparable product, right? Smaller homes. So we zoned out lots of product types between large lot single family homes and these big apartments, 4/1, 5/2 construction that many people watch on TikTok, right? The big mid-rise apartment buildings. Those are the two options, and only two options. And so one of the conversations we have in the States is about the missing middle, and it's called the missing middle because it's this whole middle array of housing choices that is missing today because of the way that we've regulated zoning and land use in the country.
Okay, that's interesting. So I think that's a little bit different to what we see our problems in the UK. It's not a problem of we have a missing middle. Certainly in the inner city, but it's an economic missing middle.
Yes.
So we have some social homes, still quite a lot of social homes in inner London, because historically everything was bombed, councils built. There was a huge building surge where I live, which has, I think, probably the most building in Europe.
Yes.
There were no private sector homes built between 1945 and 1979, I think.
Wow. Wow.
But there was the vast majority of housing was built then. It was all public construction.
Yes.
So we do have a lot of social homes. Too many of them being sold off, of course, by Margaret Thatcher and the right to buy, but we still have a lot. So you have people on low incomes living in those homes, but people often overcrowded, struggling, people struggling to move out, and the unaffordability of housing to people on low and middle incomes. And then you have people who are very wealthy, benefiting hugely from high property values, also living in city centres, and then people renting.
Yes.
But then people being unable to continue renting, particularly if they want to have kids, etc., etc. So we have a kind of, I guess, an economic missing middle of middle earners within our cities, or particularly within inner London, because of that pushing out, because of the inaffordability of housing. And the only people who are able to stay are the rich, or people who are lucky enough to get the council flats that are unfortunately scarce compared to the need.
Oh, absolutely. And and this is where I think, similar to, what happens in nature, monoculture kills.
Yeah.
And so, in the US, we neck down these choices and we have, like you, a severe shortage of homes now. Yeah. And with all of this demand coming in, and again, this is why our problem did not become as apparent as your problem as quickly as it did, right? It wasn't until the 1990s that our limits were truly tested. Yeah. And so as all of this demand came back into the cities, the limitations became abundantly clear, and prices shot through the roof.
Yeah. Whereas in the UK, you get does plan for different types of homes.
Yes.
It's just they're all unaffordable.
And they're not enough, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've done a bit of compare and contrast. The UK, the US, both have housing crises.
Yes.
Both have issues with housing supply, but different regulatory frameworks, different economic histories, and yet some of the same problems coming through. Talk me through some of the solutions that you're advocating for with Up for Growth.
Absolutely. Well, it's no doubt that we both share the problem of a severe shortage of homes. So we're about all sorts of solutions to create new housing opportunities. And I would say generally, these solutions tend to fall into what I'd call three buckets. Number one, like you, discretion and uncertainty in the housing delivery process is a huge blocker. The fact that in California, it can take upwards of 10 years to go from initial planning application to simply project approval, never mind getting the building completed. It is a huge impediment to attracting the capital that is needed. Because remember, we are very reliant on the private sector capital markets to create the homes in our country that we need.
Yeah. Not much public house building in the US these days. Historically, yes.
We do have stock. We do have a tradition of public housing in the US. That housing has become very dilapidated over time. It's been difficult for a number of public housing authorities to manage their portfolios. Living conditions, often cases, are suboptimal, not quality, not necessarily as safe as one would expect. But we have been experimenting and developing new strategies to redevelop that public housing over time. And so now there are really interesting projects funded in part by public sources and in part by private sources to transform these communities into walkable, mixed use, mixed income, importantly, communities. And so that's a really great way to achieve both economic mobility outcomes as well as to address the housing gap. But broadly speaking, we are heavily reliant on the private home building sector to meet our housing needs. And so land use, zoning policy, even building codes are all squarely in our sights as policies that we must reform and improve.
Let me come in there. So I'm particularly interested in issues of housing justice.
Yes.
And one of the concerns I have with the YIMBY movement in the UK is that supply helps the best off first.
Right.
And everybody else has to wait their turn.
Yes.
Now, I don't wholly think that, of course, because if somebody moves into a flat, they move out of another flat, etc., etc. But fundamentally, a policy that helps the best off first, unless you are at the same time building social housing, or that would be how the UK model would work.
Yes.
How can you use the YIMBY approach to genuinely meet different people's housing needs at the same time?
And this is where I might deviate with some advocates on the YIMBY side, which is it's not enough to just simply build more homes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, right? Like supply is critically important. It's absolutely necessary. It is by itself insufficient.
Yeah.
And so what we have today, driven, I would say, by two large forces. One, the lack of investment in affordable housing. And number two, a system that has been gummed up by a vetocracy and a very Byzantine and complicated regulatory framework. And so our view is that, look, we're an 8-person team in Washington, D.C. We can only do so many things. And so we do focus on supply. But we mustn't forget that you can't solve this problem by just building what the market will bear. There is a floor in terms of prices and affordability that the private sector can deliver. But the problem is, if we only subsidize affordable housing, we perversely create more rent-seeking behavior. Imagine the U.S. government appropriated enough voucher subsidy into the market.
What's voucher subsidy? Just talk us through that.
We subsidize affordable housing in two ways. One on the supply side, which is directing money directly into the building of affordable income-restricted housing. We also provide portable vouchers, imagine a coupon.
Pay people's rent, basically.
Worth money to pay rent, exactly.
So similar to housing benefit, the housing part of universal credit.
Absolutely. And so if we only did that, we would simply funnel money into a system that doesn't produce housing, rents would go up.
You know, is what's happening with private landlords and universal credit and the issues with temporary accommodation. We've got public money going towards private landlords who get richer and richer.
Right.
And you know, it causes more inequality. But of course, we can't have people with nowhere to live.
Right.
The state needs to ensure people have somewhere to live, but it's an inefficient system that's making the problem worse.
It's absolutely inefficient, and we need a we need a yes and approach. And so zoning is, in the way that we talk about it, a highly discretionary, highly complicated, highly restrictive framework that really limits, not enables, what can be built. So that's, I think, a key insight, right? As you all talk about creating zoning here. We're after the same thing. It's more of creating a clear and objective set of rules. And expediting
I would
the time that it takes to deliver.
I'm not the hugest lover of zoning. I'm not. I guess there's a form of planning reform that is deregulation.
Yes.
In the UK, I would like good, speedy regulation. I would like partnership working. I would like community building and building public spaces through a planning system that isn't risky. My concern with the planning system is that it's incredibly risky, and then a lot of resources wasted on the risk, managing the risk, which is completely created by the bureaucracy. There's no need for it to be there. So when people talk about zoning in the UK, they're talking about creating some kind of certainty, but inherent in the call for zoning is a call for the kind of zoning that meets housing needs, which it sounds like in the US there is a missing piece between having zoning, which does give some kind of economic certainty to people making investment decisions, and having zoning in such a way that it is meeting the needs of the people living in that area.
Absolutely. And I'll give you a perfect example. New Rochelle, New York, another one of these bucolic, leafy suburbs. About 5 years ago, New Rochelle, New York, a leafy bucolic suburb, has been a place that has produced very little housing relative to population growth. Home prices have soared. The baby boomers have done very well for themselves in terms of building equity. But young people priced out of Manhattan are looking desperately for places within commute distance to their jobs.
Familiar.
Yes. And so the city of New Rochelle, as it happened, had an abandoned, vacant downtown core that interestingly was served by high-speed rail. And it takes about 20 minutes to get from downtown New Rochelle to midtown Manhattan. And so in their wisdom, the city partnered with a private sector developer who offered to do a really important thing, which is to clear the environmental regulatory threshold by performing an environmental impact assessment and clearing the path for a very ambitious target of homes, 10,000.
10,000.
Yes.
Good. So I want to unpack the 10,000.
Yes.
Talk us through that environmental process, because we're having discussions in the UK at the moment about a different way to, at the moment, UK environmental protections related to housing, they're very piecemeal. You need to have like a net biodiversity gain on a specific site. It doesn't really make sense. There's not a mechanism for funding big improvements. You have mad stuff happening with infrastructure, like £100 million spent on a bat tunnel.
Yes, I've heard.
The bat tunnel. Have you heard about the fish disco?
I have not heard about the fish disco.
The fish disco is building a nuclear power plant. Great. But so that fish aren't sucked in, I think millions and millions of pounds were spent on a fish disco because the fish, they don't like the disco. They want to go elsewhere.
Yes.
But these kind of ridiculous huge uses of money that are not actually helping the important situation for UK is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. We need to do something about this.
Absolutely.
But we need to do something about it in a strategic way rather than a piecemeal way.
Well, look, I consider myself an environmentalist, and so, I don't think anyone would debate that it's getting hotter in the summers, and we're seeing a lot of increased hurricane activity in the Atlantic. We're seeing wildfires in the western U.S. Run rampant. So we can't ignore that. And environmental regulation is critically important. But what I'll tell you is this. In the United States, our National Environmental Protection Act, and more specifically state versions that have been implemented in places like California and New York, have become not environmental policies, but rather systems that preservers of the status quo, you could call them, or NIMBYs, can game to hold up.
There's a historic tree.
Yeah, there's a leopard in our
if there were a leopard in East London, that would be, I would love
that. Neighborhood in the Bay Area, right? And so the issue isn't protecting the environment. The issue is having created a system that can be weaponized as a veto and a hold up on housing. And so in New York, there's a policy called SEEKR, and that's the state's environmental protection law. And in so many cases, project will pursue approval, has to perform a project-level environmental assessment, and then subsequently is sued by a neighborhood association or a concerned citizen for somehow presumably violating or causing harm to the environment.
And I bet it's not about the environment; it's about house prices.
Right. These appeals are occurring in city centers, in close-in streetcar suburbs. And so you know what happens? These projects don't get built. People have to go somewhere. We build more homes in unincorporated America, in non-urban America, right, outside of our job centers, than we do within them, because infill, as it is here, is very difficult and runs headlong into these barriers. So guess what? We have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of more cars on the road, releasing much more carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, doing much more harm to the environment, but also compromising quality of life and economic productivity. So in the pursuit of environmental protection, we're actually doing much more harm to the environment through these, let's say, unintended consequences. And so that's a major, so getting back to New Rochelle, this investment cleared the path for 10,000 new homes by handling the environmental assessment not at a project level, but at an entire neighborhood level. And that was a really critical move from a planning standpoint to unlock that production.
Strategic approach.
Absolutely. And then, of course, zoning. And the zoning that was implemented in this core of New Rochelle is what we call form-based code. So it's defining the building envelope, common characteristics in a clear and objective way, not subject to discretion. and importantly, ministerial approvals. So you know what boxes to check, you know what requirements are there, including design requirements, but it is not left to a layperson body who can weigh in, presumably under the pretext of design review or landmarks, but instead agreed upon frameworks. And that has now unleashed more than 3,000 units of new homes in the city of New Rochelle, which once was producing 10, 20, 30 maybe new homes per year. So in my mind, it's not just about zoning, but it's about tackling all of the blockers in a comprehensive and a strategic way to unlock more homes.
I mean, that sounds kind of, in a way, similar to the Brownfield Passports approach, if you like.
Yes.
The idea that there should be certain areas of, particularly, I guess, on the edge of urban areas, places near train stations, where, you know, you have a lot of disused car parks near train stations, that there should be a kind of a simple package drawn up by the council or drawn up by central government to say, oh, you can build X stories of housing here, X units, you've got to provide this amount of affordable, etc., but a real simplification of the planning process, where instead of having a to and fro between the council and the developer and all that kind of stuff, because it's just such a good place to build housing because of the transport and infrastructure that makes it accessible, makes it likely that people are going to want to live there, probably means that the housing will sell for quite a lot of money, and therefore you can get quite a lot of affordable housing out of it. Making that really simple and drawing up those again simple frameworks that then people can build to, that has been set out through negotiation with the community, through local political control, etc. But that enabling approach, as opposed to the discretionary to and fro risk. Is it going to happen? Is it going to be delayed because, I don't know, there's a bat on the site or something like that?
Yes.
Instead, and then also tackling environmental problems on an actual strategic level, so you can put in place some of the big changes that need to happen to improve the environment.
More housing near jobs in transit is, if not the number one, in the top three of environmental strategies in my view.
Density, absolutely. Public transport.
Climate change. Absolutely. And I'll just say, you know, as I've spent this week here in London, and I've spoken with, I think, over 15 stakeholders at this point, I've discovered one of the common threads is infill development is difficult everywhere because our systems of policy and regulation have empowered the voices to maintain the status quo.
Yeah. Well, also in the UK, infill development is difficult because of the housing market's over-focus on large developers.
Yes.
And the fact that the planning system has made it very difficult for smaller developers, A, to start up, and B, to continue, because it's very slow, it's very risky, they can't sustain it. The big guys can. And so we get this focus towards the large developers who, of course, want larger sites, but larger sites don't sell as quickly because location is important. You know, if you've got 100 homes on the market, 1,000 homes on the market in somewhere, well, you're not going to be selling them as regularly if you've got, you know, 10 here, 10 here, 10 here.
And I think there's a huge parallel to the U.S. experience there, because we have, let's say, a barbell approach to housing development, a very much a monoculture. It's very hard for the entrepreneurial, small, medium enterprise builders to enter the market. And so I'll give you another example. In California, 10 years ago, building a granny flat in the backyard, absolutely illegal, not allowed under zoning codes. Today, after a number of state bills that have created, as of right, building permissions, ministerial permissions to build granny flats, 20% of all new units built over the last several years in California are granny flats.
Sounds like Croydon Council's small sites policy.
And it opens up the door for a new generation of developers that we desperately need. Our industry is so, and I'll tell this to my development friends, so old, so white, so male, right?
Yeah.
And we lose. Our built environment is built by a very narrow set of lived experiences. And so I believe that to the extent we can create a new generation of developers that come from a more diverse array of experiences, will enrich our built environment. It'll result in more interesting and more diverse communities, and communities that frankly offer a lot more choice to the consumers, right? This is good for business, for real estate, but it's also great for the bones and the sustainability of our communities.
Yeah. I mean, I think music to my ears. I guess I'm concerned about the UK's housing oligarchy.
Yeah.
And I want to see more SMEs in the market, because I want to see more nimble methods of construction that are more environmentally friendly.
Absolutely.
I want to see more innovation. I want to see more jobs localized in different parts of the country. All of those things that we are missing out on. And we're seeing in the UK certainly a kind of a squeezing of, because the planning system creates this shortage of available land, which I hope the government will deal with and bring forward more land to build on.
Yes.
We're seeing the squeezing out of smaller developers. If we had a similar structure of housing, house builders to what we had in the 90s, we'd probably be building an extra 70,000 homes in the UK. But because the market structure has changed, that is frustrating the ability to build as much as we need. So this is, I agree with you wholeheartedly about the need to improve and diversify the construction sector.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think a little bit different in terms of the product types you're talking about, because we have planning, because we have community engagement. It doesn't have to be just what the developer wants. We don't have that zoning system. But what we have with our planning system is the uncertainty, the risk, and then the economic waste of someone spent millions of pounds drawing up some designs that get thrown out for a spurious reason. And then it gets thrown on appeal, but it's such a waste of resource at a time when we really need to be getting more investment into the housing system.
Absolutely. And I think that we are on the verge of a huge sea change in our politics around housing supply, affordable housing, finance. I was with a new member of Congress in Arizona several weeks ago, Congresswoman Yasamin Ansari.
Okay.
And she was a former city council member. And she was asked, she relayed the story where she was asked, well, you were a former city council member. Why do you advocate for policies that would take power away from local city council members? And her response was, listen, local control is very important, but I do not need the local control to say no to every single housing proposal that comes my way. I would like to focus on saying yes.
But I guess, how do we get to a political stage where we have the local yes?
Renters in government.
Renters in government, yeah.
Young people in government.
Young people in government. I guess,
Absolutely.
I mean, that comes down to one of my, what I'm always ranting on a podcast about the UK as a gerontocracy. I'll get lots of hate online if I talk about the pensioner dictatorship, but we have an economy that is structured towards one generation.
Yes.
And the political inability to actually do something about it. I was speaking at an event last night, and a woman in good faith, I was talking about how housing supply is important, but it's not the only thing that's important. But it is a very necessary but not sufficient condition, as you put it earlier. And she was like, well, shouldn't we be encouraging more older people to take in lodgers? And I'm like, no, I don't want to live in a flat share with an older person. I want to be able to afford a home of my own. This isn't an unrealistic expectation. And yet the attitude is that, well, young people need to kind of, I guess, adapt to this economic reality, which is an unjust economic reality that we need to fix.
Absolutely. And of course, the home you live in and the ability to go to work without spending hours on multiple trains is critical to a thriving community and economy. Here's a different take on the gerontocracy piece. I mean, first of all, I agree with the general premise, and we do need more voices in our politics and in our policy leadership. But I will tell you that it's no cakewalk for our aging elders in our communities today, even if they have a home, right? Yeah. It's, frankly, kids leave the nest. You're getting older. You're perhaps in a 2 or 3 level home. is not necessarily the best environment for you either. One of the biggest advocates for zoning reform and housing supply in America today is AARP.
What's AARP?
The American Association of Retired People.
Well, that's interesting because one of our problems in the UK is that we don't build enough older people's housing that is in areas where people want to live, next to amenities, in places where there is a sense of community that is suitable for people's needs. We have people living in, 2-story family homes and then care homes, and there isn't that intermediate place. And what we see is that people who are living in houses with rickety stairs, etc., maybe they've got 4 bedrooms.
Absolutely.
They're much more likely to have a fall. They're much more likely to end up in hospital and, frankly, much more likely to die earlier.
Absolutely.
And what we need to be doing is building the housing that people could move into in the kind of communities that people want to live in to kind of tackle some of the isolation, which has, huge negative impacts, loneliness, etc. And we're not doing that. And that's a real shame because that also means that we then have people who are living in homes that they don't need all that space. They'd be better off if they were able to sell it, release some of that value, and then that house could be used for a family, say. But because we don't have that option for people to move on if they want to, people are stuck and we're not making the best use of the existing housing. To which the woman replied, "Oh, well, but you could just become a lodger." And I'm like, I don't want to live with you, lady. Come on.
Well, PadSplit is an innovative company in the U.S. that is doing some of that. And I would say there are advantages to intergenerational living and
of course,
renting out a room.
If people want that, great.
Absolutely.
I don't think that
should be a choice.
It should be a choice. It shouldn't be economically forced on people. And it's not a good fix for a housing system to be like, well, just move in with someone else.
Absolutely. And what I'll also say is that there are advantages, not just to a mix of incomes, but a mix of ages in a community.
Yep.
One of the big areas of emphasis, frankly, for later living, I think you call it here in the UK.
I guess that people who build it and market it call it that.
I see.
I'd call it older people's housing, but yeah.
Yeah, so transit-oriented development is fantastic for seniors.
Would you say
transit-oriented, or maybe what you call transport-oriented development?
Yeah, I guess. I mean,
building
around train stations.
Trains. You can get to the hospital. You can get to your kid's neighborhood. What might even be better are cottage clusters and smaller duplex apartments for seniors to actually have an option to not just move to a smaller unit, but stay in the neighborhood.
Yeah, I think that's
close to where their kids
Stay
are.
In your community.
Right.
The housing available for people in the community.
Whenever a community chooses to cast its neighborhood in amber and we lose the physical mobility, bad things happen, right? We don't create that life cycle of housing.
Yeah.
And we don't have housing options for every life stage. And that's a shame, right?
Yeah.
That's a real negative outcome of having the housing shortage we face today.
Yeah. But I feel that in the UK, housing has become such a source of wealth.
Yes.
And people want to, there are all kinds of reasons why people oppose new housing near where they are. But often it comes down to, or at least the economic effect is that those who have housing, their wealth increases, and those who don't, they're left paying. And those we're seeing with my generation now, those who are able to buy housing are usually those who've inherited or been gifted deposits by their parents. And we're seeing that economic inequality expanding because of our inability to tax housing well, and our inability to tax inheritance properly, and our acceptance, I guess, that housing is something that's just going to go up and up in value at a rate that far surpasses the rate that wages are increasing.
But the reality is, I believe, given the really unique interest rate conditions and demographic shifts over the past 80 years, the baby boomer generation, who largely is the generation that received the windfall of home price appreciation, That's not going to happen again.
Yeah.
So I do understand that there's this tension, right?
Yeah.
We want housing to be affordable, but those of us who own our homes would like to see our equity in our homes increase.
And it comes out in politics.
Absolutely. And we have to stop thinking about our house as a lottery ticket, right? It's not property ladder anymore, right? We have to think about our house, yes, as an asset, but also just part of our community fabric.
Yeah.
And so I think those are really compelling reasons, despite potential personal gains, to realize that saying yes to housing makes our entire communities richer, more prosperous, and thriving. And I do think that as we see more voices, I was just with Councilwoman Shreya Nanda from
she's been on the pod.
Islington, and she's terrific. And she's one of those voices that's really putting her work where her mouth is in working on approving new homes across her borough. And I just think that as we continue to do this work and advocate for more housing choice, we're going to see those outcomes. We're going to see our policies improve. But there is certainly a lot of work to do and a lot of reasons for folks to get more involved in the movement.
Yeah. I mean, I'm feeling what we need is a pro-housing consensus.
Yes.
In the way that actually the UK in the 60s, the government that built the most council housing in the UK was a Tory government. Because at that time, there was an economic consensus that recognised it was a good idea for the state to accumulate the asset at a time when land was very cheap. There was a need to rebuild, et cetera, et cetera. State was able to create that asset. And then we saw subsequent Tory governments, of course, begin to sell that off. But there was an economic consensus about meeting our needs publicly, and even right-wing governments didn't challenge that. And I guess what I think we need in the UK now is a pro-housing consensus, so that we don't see what we've seen in the past, which is interest groups lobbying against the building of more homes. There needs to be a consensus that supply is important. Who owns that supply? Who builds the supply? All of those kind of questions still to be worked out, but we need that pro-housing consensus. And until we get there, we're going to have these persistent issues with housing supply and then rising inequality.
And I think, our conversation about land is critical here, right? One of the observations is that just as zoning harms both market rate developers in the U.S. as well as affordable builders, the lack of available land means that land is scarce, land is expensive, and only a few can make economic sense of building, right? And to the extent that we start to think about, I understand you're now setting mandatory targets here in the UK for new housing over planning cycles.
We have done for a while, but they're not met.
And it sounds like there's increasing teeth to it, right? Maybe not.
I wait and see. I think the UK is, every government talks in the ambition of building new homes, and they don't.
I would say don't think about 5 years of land supply. Plan for 30 years of land supply, because not all of it will get built out, as you know,
of course,
in 5 years. And so the more land that you can make available for housing, the less special each site is, and the more available it is to a number of developers. You want more developers in the market? You want more builders in the market? Minority and women-led builders, right? Let's get out of the scarcity mindset. Let's take an abundance mindset and apply it to land.
I guess people would say that makes sense in the US, quite a big place. People in the UK have a sense that, we're a small country, everything's tight, everything's restricted. I'm not sure I agree with this. I went to an event on the National Land Use Strategy. I know how to have fun. Where it was argued that we only needed 0.2% of land to switch to becoming housing land to build the 1.5 million new homes that are needed. We have, different economists will say we have different levels of housing that's needed, but it's certainly more than 1.5 million. But it's not a huge amount of land that is actually needed to switch. But what is needed perhaps is more density. But there is, I guess, an attitude here that land is scarce. It's precious. There are trade-offs. Agricultural lands. We talked about nature depletion earlier. There is a sense that this is something precious. We need to be careful with it. It's why we have such intense conversations about the Greenbelt, because people imagine it as, this beautiful parkland. They don't imagine garages in Hillingdon. But anyway, and we've talked about on the pod in the past, the green belt, grey belt, etc., and the reclassification of it. But it is politically contested. When you want to bring more land forward for housing, it is seen as there's a trade-off.
Absolutely, and I think the trade-off here is how do you? No one has perfect knowledge of what sites will be feasible. No one has perfect knowledge. I mean, who in 2018 would have imagined how much pressure there would have been on housing outside of Greater London because of the flow of folks wanting to get out of the crowded city during the pandemic, right? And so I understand a target for housing production. Let's create flexibility in the system. At least that's the American conversation. Now, listen, I understand here many British citizens think that America is, has lots and lots of land. The reality is,
just look quite big on the map.
the land on the map, right, is not all developable, and not all. The demand for housing again is in our city centers. The demand for housing is in our job centers.
Of course.
And so it doesn't make sense to pull water, sewer, all of the infrastructure into America's western land, right? It's uneconomical. And so our challenge is I would say just as limited by land supply as yours. And it's a real challenge. And in America, every developable site is a snowflake. Part of it is artificial, right? We've restricted on our own accord how much land that can be developed. But it's also financial feasibility. And so opening the aperture provides that optionality, that flexibility for builders to better meet the market. But agreed on the land conservation front, it has to be strategic. It has to be dense. And again, we're not talking about creating block towers 20, 40 stories high and blocking out all the sunlight. Density can be beautiful. Just look at Paris, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's about being smart about this and creating as much flexibility, certainty, and permissiveness as you can to allow the creativity of folks in the social housing sector and the private sector.
Coming to that, so Paris, great example of density, urban density, frequently blocks that are kind of 8 stories high. London has the mansion blocks in West London, but historic fire restrictions after the Great Fire have limited the height. But Paris, on the good hand, it's got, on the one hand, it's got a lot of density. On the other hand, they have a model of affordable housing where they've created huge social segregation. And areas that are poorer. They have a much more racialized pattern of housing. And you can see inequality in the streets of Paris in a way that you can't in the same way in London. There's a huge amount of inequality in London, but communities are genuinely mixed, even if people's lives are not genuinely mixed. What I'm interested to hear about, I guess, from your point of view, what are some good innovative mechanisms for ensuring that housing affordability comes as well as just housing supply?
Absolutely. Well, you need targeted investment in, let's say, housing infrastructure and even vertical infrastructure. I know the history.
Vertical infrastructure?
Well, look, to build a high-rise tower costs a multiple of at least 5, if not 10, of a mid-rise building. And to build a mid-rise building is, from a cost standpoint, a significant multiple over 2 or 3 story garden apartment houses. And so in the same way, when we think about it in a U.S. context, in the same way that America financed federal highway expansion to open up tracts of developable land for those Levitowns to be built, we know that the market wants walkable urbanism. The market really wants compact development, dare I say density, right? And so part of the solution might be, instead of outlaying hundreds of millions of dollars in horizontal infrastructure expansion, subsidizing the structural cost of density that enables us to build more units to the acre, which is a great solution to affordability on relatively scarce urban land. In France, we have a similar dismal history of public housing and segregation, as France does. And the same can be said about our zoning policies, frankly. But one of the novel approaches I understand in France that's being applied is investing in a set-aside of affordable housing, meaning if you have an apartment block with 200 units, the French government will inject subsidy to offset the costs, the investment costs of setting aside permanently affordable homes. It's not just a great affordable housing strategy, it's a great economic mobility strategy. We have to be more thoughtful and deliberate to create communities where everyone, from the banker and the CEO to the school teacher and the janitor, to get to live in the community where they work. It's just fair, and it's just humane, and it's frankly what it takes to build an interesting place to live. So that's how we think about this housing conundrum, right? Which is, how do you ensure that your new supply isn't just market rate? And again, it's going to require the rolling up the sleeves of policymakers, and those policymakers also putting capital where their mouth is to achieve those outcomes.
In a way, that's a little bit how the UK Section 106 system works.
Yes.
You take some grant, either it goes, the developers are required to build X proportion of affordable, ideally 35-50, and that, has improved over time as it's bedded into land values. The developer is required to build something, then a social landlord has some money and buys it off the developer. It requires public subsidy. But what we're seeing in the UK is that the government has, to their credit, tried to put in a lot of money. It's not enough. It's not gonna meet the need that we have for affordable housing. So just government subsidy isn't gonna work. What are the other solutions?
You need to build a lot more housing, and you need to continue to build that housing even through the down cycles. This is the tension, right? We talk about homeowners being quasi-winners in the environment of scarcity. I sometimes will hear, even from market rate developers, it's not necessarily a bad thing if we stop building. Rents will catch up. Rents will grow, right? That means we get better returns. Well, that's very short-sighted, first of all. So let's set that aside. And more likely to happen
when you've got a few developers than many, of course, which is why the structure of the housing market is really important.
Why the volume and why the supply of development capacity is so important. But here's what I would say to that, right? We have an opportunity in the development context to create a situation where it is a win-win. And by that I mean enabling the development sector to continue to build housing over time will enable public sector resources to be deployed much more efficiently. We won't have the whipsaw of hot market and soft market. That means that we have a lot of housing in a cycle, and we might see transitory reductions in the cost of a home purchase or the cost of rent. But that these developers won't continue to build as those rents soften. And so what happens is the rents shoot back up, and we lose the public policy benefit of housing abundance. And so we think that creating more of a consistent stream of supply enables the market to contribute, broad-based affordability to be generated as older units age, and for targeted public sector investment in affordable housing to go much further than it otherwise would. But here's the thing. You can't lean on the private sector to fund that, right? These are capitalists. And so this, in our mind, is a really great opportunity for targeted investment. Imagine the balance sheet of, and I know this is radical, right? So I'm going to talk about in a U.S. context, right? Leveraging our agencies, our Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac lenders, to lend or to invest into the soft cycle to ensure that housing engine continues to crank. And so that creates that win-win where affordable developers are able to participate, small and medium builders are able to deliver missing middle housing at scale, multifamily gets built, and all together, we have a robust supply of homes that are being delivered year over year. Yeah. And again, a distribution, a life cycle of housing is created to suit every resident, no matter what their age, their life situation is. And I know that that's a bit...
That sounds great.
Right.
My concern is getting there. So
Absolutely.
we feel like we feel because rightly we are in such an emergency with our housing at the moment. We don't want to be waiting for a certain point in the market to put in that public investment in. I understand the principle of using public investment strategically. There's a great economist who has a new town. Is it named after him? I don't know, Milton Keynes. But that is a great system once you're in that system.
Yes.
At the moment, we just want to build as much housing as possible because we've got such a shortage. How do we create the economic change needed to get us there?
Yeah, it's investment. So from a U.S. perspective, the economy is very challenging for new development. The rents that are achievable in this market, they have fallen, given some transitory oversupply over the last few years. Take Portland, Oregon, for example, where the value of an apartment unit today is arguably less than what it would cost to build. So the market in Portland, Oregon has come to a standstill.
Yeah. Similar in parts of Northern England.
Interesting.
We're seeing an issue of it would cost more to build a home that would be sold for because there isn't the economic development in that area to buy that home. And so the need for state investment to get that started.
Right. This is the demonstration of this tension where the more housing you build and you start to see the public good of more affordability, it's great, but it's short-lived because you can't rely on the private sector to finance uneconomic, let's say, projects, right? But the problem there is that we will never get to our end goal, which is broad-based affordability. And so we say the only way is through. So in Montgomery County, Maryland, which is a jurisdiction just north of Washington, D.C., it's sort of a collection of bedroom communities, the county itself has put its balance sheet to work. Now, again, I don't know if the realities of the UK will allow this approach to happen, but sort of hear this out, right? The balance sheet is used to invest equity into new market rate development at rates that are much lower than what a private sector investor would require. Whereas a private sector investor would require an 18% rate of return, the county is investing in equity investment and development at sub 5% rates. Which is incredible, right? It brings the cost of capital to build down to a level that solves for the point at which we are in the market, where the costs to build are high and the rents on the other side are relatively low. And what's happened, now that they've been at this for several years, I mean, two things. One, this program has generated on the order of thousands, I believe the current number is 5,000 homes that have been built using these resources. Number two, these aren't loans. These aren't grants. The jurisdiction is getting paid back. And so it's able to recycle the capital. Now, you may say, is that fair to the taxpayer?
Well, I think my parallel is, so I strongly support state investment in housing, obviously. It's called Left on Red. But also, I think the UK parallel for some of that investment that is needed is perhaps with our big pension funds.
Yes.
So particularly for social housing, we
Yes.
have big pension funds, social housing in particular gives a very clear return, long-term investment, but clear return because that rental income is guaranteed by government.
Yes.
You know, if the person living there can't afford to pay it, there will be housing benefit, etc., to support that.
Absolutely.
Is it at a level enough for it to be competitive? Perhaps not, and therein lies the problem. But I do think there is a need for the UK to manage its investments, particularly those big pension funds, better in a way that they are doing something that's socially useful.
Yes. And the beauty of investing in these larger projects with a mix of incomes is that it's not dollar for dollar. You're getting a 5x, 8x, 10x return because all of the investment is not funding all of the project cost. And so in exchange for the lower rate of return that this county is charging, it's getting a provision of 20, 30% affordable homes. So it's a way to keep the market moving and also to ensure that particularly in the softer sides of the market, you're getting not just market rate housing, but affordable housing in the long term. And so these are approaches that are being taken right now. These are new approaches. The city of Atlanta just implemented a very similar program. And we're hopeful that this is a really key unlock to ensuring more robust production over time.
Interesting. I want to ask you, because we've had the designated survivor on the pod. So there are discussions at the moment about introducing a social housing tax credit, or in the US, low-income housing tax credit, to get more money into social housing or low-income housing. Because one of the issues we have in the UK, the government is close to their, self-imposed, but if you go beyond it, the interest increased a lot, borrowing limit. So it's difficult for the government to borrow more to build the amount of social housing that we need. But the tax credit option gives the ability to bring in that investment that is needed in a way that potentially offsets the huge amount of money that we spend supporting the private housing market for people on low incomes, which, waste, increasing inequality, et cetera, but necessary because we don't have enough social housing. The tax credit option gives us a way of, not taking that tax later, but also reducing the amount of money that is needed to be spent because we have an asset of some social, genuinely affordable housing that people can be living in instead of going into homelessness, instead of going into temporary accommodation, which is devastating for individuals, but also devastating for the public purse as well.
Yes. It's a great idea.
Yeah.
I would say that the principle that we discussed relative to zoning and land use should apply here as well in implementation, which is keep it as simple as possible.
Yeah.
And keep the credit focused on affordable housing.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
One of the challenges in the United States, and the low-income housing tax credit is our most productive tool to produce affordable homes in the country. But one of the challenges are the additional requirements that are tacked on, and tacked on for good reason. Things like wage requirements, things like sustainability requirements to site land in particular opportunity zone areas.
What are wage requirements?
We have a law called the Davis-Bacon Wage Requirement Law. And one of the challenges, look, this is very challenging because every market is different. And labor supply is a real challenge in markets around the country.
So wage requirements as in people need to be paid a certain wage to build them?
That's right, and specific to the trade. So it's an elevated standard above what you might call prevailing wage requirements that the labor unions will negotiate.
Right, okay.
And so this raises the cost. And so now we have stories coming out where the development, or the building of a studio apartment or a small one-bedroom apartment in Washington, D.C. is upwards of $1.2 million, whereas a completely unsubsidized building of the same architecture, of the same of the same building standards would be a fraction of that price.
Okay.
And so keeping it simple will enable you to maximize the utility of those dollars.
Interesting, because instinctively I like the idea of being able to force up wages.
Absolutely. And the question is, what are you optimizing for? Are you optimizing for scale of building as many homes as possible? Or are you intending to subsidize wages?
Yeah.
And if your objective is to subsidize wages, great. That's a terrific basis to craft that policy. But the problem is add-ons. I think I've heard it described as the everything bagel approach.
Yeah, I was thinking about the everythingism.
Yes,
everythingism.
everythingism. And, when you go down that road, the policy trade-off is that, sure, you can require that, right? You can require bird glass in all high-rise buildings to
Swift
protect
bricks.
your right, yes.
Yeah.
But again, it trades off with fewer units.
Yeah. But I think that comes from certainly, having done some political planning in the past, it comes from having a limited number of tools available.
Yes.
So tools within the planning system in the UK.
Yes.
Being also tools of economic development, also tools of environmental improvement.
Yes.
Tools of managing inequality, etc. We put a huge burden on housing construction and the money that comes through housing construction because local government doesn't have resources the other way.
Too few tools in the toolbox.
So you have to do things, and quite rightly, you should, I think, do things like requiring decent wages. You should be requiring educational and training opportunities. You should be requiring investment to public parks, to public transport, etc., etc. But what is used is this engine of housing delivery, and all of the money related to this is, scarce. And if you're going to have these things, which are all great things, all things that we should aspire to, that means you're going to get fewer housing units in the end.
Yes. And perhaps the counterfactual to that would be, let's focus on unlocking as many units as possible and therefore create as many jobs as possible and create more demand than ever before for labor. Which will ultimately drive up wages in a sustainable way with more work for everyone. It's not carving up a discrete piece of pie, right, or a discrete pie into different slices,
the growth
right?
Argument, yeah.
It is growing a garden of opportunity.
See why you called your organization this?
There you go.
There we go.
We're up for growth.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining me, Mike.
You, Eve.
And I guess one last question. If you were president for the day, what would be your one housing policy that you would love to enact?
I would love to redevelop every Amtrak service parking lot across the United States, every transit parking lot. Let's build housing near transit. Yep. And we have a bill for that.
Ooh, brilliant.
Thank you
so much, Mike. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thanks for listening.